We'll be talking about chefs from the 19th century. We'll be talking about chefs from the 19th century, which of course seems impossibly far away. Obviously, in a historical perspective, that's not true. We're talking about people from the 1800s. And there are a few to know about, some of which you'll find in the resource section of this class. We're really going to focus kind of on the four big ones, or the four ones that I think are still important with us today. The first of which is Antonin Carême. Now, Carême is a great example of what I think of as the meritocracy of the kitchen. He was a person of low birth. In fact, he was an orphan who had been abandoned, had been taken in by a restaurateur, pastry chef, and demonstrated great ability and rose to kind of the highest ranks of his profession, notably cooking for the French statesman Talleyrand, and for Napoleon, who, although he didn't care about food so much, knew that other people did, and that it was wise to have someone like Carême on his staff. Carême is known for being a pastry chef, and he used to create these elaborate things called pièces montées, which were made out of sugar, and hopefully I'll be able to post some drawings of what those things looked like. And these were paraded around the dining room, often on carts, sometimes set on a table or at a side, and they were often these architectural models, and usually having some kind of connection to one of the guests of honor. So if there were somebody from another country, the Prime Minister of England or something like that, dining, although unlikely since England and France were at war. Let's say a representative of Germany. There might be some, representation of a German building, or some sort of scene from German mythology, other things like that, so that the guest would feel welcomed and honored. Carême was known as the Cook of Kings, which was a title that another of the chefs we'll be talking about, Auguste Escoffier, also had claim to. Among the things that Carême is credited for is the invention of the toque, or the white hat that chefs wore for many years. That may or may not be true, hard to say. One thing that certainly is true is that he did drawings of sort of an updated and more fashionable chef's uniform. Again, I should be able to post some drawings of what those two things look like, and you'll see that in the drawing he really kind of tried to make himself, who I think was the model for the figures, into kind of a more romantic figure. So he did that. He also was the first to start a system of sauces based on the mother sauces, which in his time there were four. By the time we get to Escoffier, who really laid out this development, there would be five. Do you remember what they are, or have you probably haven't learned that yet in Chef Amy Vala's class, but you will soon. So there's Carême. I've got a little video about him. I encourage you to do some more research about him as well. One other note about Carême: he was really kind of the first, what we think of as celebrity chef, a title that I kind of wish would go away and we could go back to just being craftsmen, or craftspeople, let's say, and doing our work in the more relative obscurity that we used to do it in. The other kind of notable thing about him, which is a tragic thing, is that he died pretty young, at 48, from the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning, which most historians attribute to a lifetime spent in a rather brutal kitchen environment. So think just for a minute about what kitchen life was like back in the 1800s. We're coming into the industrial era, into the, what we think of kind of as our modern era, yet there was in the kitchens no electricity. So no blenders, no food processors, none of the things things that we kind of take for granted. There was not cooking with gas or obviously electricity, so there was really very little temperature regulation on our stoves and stove tops. Um, there were very few of any kind of labor saving devices, and so if you think our kitchen work is hard now, which it is, believe me, it was really tough then. So, my hat is really off to him and all of the other people who toiled away in kitchens so many years ago, because we have it far easier. Um, in many ways, our restaurant industry, even though we're in the 21st century, is still stuck in portions of the 19th century. We could have much better environments in the kitchen than we currently do. Part of the problem is that technology and that equipment is prohibitively expensive right now, so we continue to work with things that are really kind of outdated. For instance, using gas to cook food. 90% of the energy produced with a gas range is wasted, just wasted as heat. So we heat up our kitchens more than we actually heat up our food. Induction is a much, much more efficient way to cook, but you have to have special pans. There are other issues associated with that, mostly issues of expense, but boy, am I looking forward to the time when our kitchens can be cooler and more technologically driven. Another of the giants of 19th century cooking was Auguste Escoffier, obviously another French person. Escoffier really streamlined a lot of the operations. He took over from where kind of Carême left off and made things a bit simpler. He got rid of those architectural set pieces, the pièce montée that Carême was noted for. He furthered kind of those sauces that were based on those mother sauces and all of those variations. He published what was called the Guide Culinaire, which is kind of a shorthand book for anybody in kitchens, so that you knew how to make a sauce Périgord or a sauce Talleyrand or other things just by quickly referring to this guide. So not a cookbook in our traditional sense, but more kind of a quick list of the ingredients that would go into certain dishes, so that if a customer requested something, they could be produced fairly easily with somebody with kind of the standard kitchen knowledge of the time. Now, Escoffier also instituted what we call the brigade system, so a specific person responsible for specific dishes within the kitchen. For instance, the poissonnier would be responsible for fish dishes. Now, if you're not working in a French restaurant these days, we might not have these same names, but we still generally assign cooks to stations. So somebody might be working the grill station, another person might be working the sauté station, somebody else would be working the garde-manger, which is generally the cold appetizers and or dessert section. So he really introduced that kind of based on his time in the military. He was also known as the chef of kings, and served lots of both famous and infamous people. He created a number of dishes named after people like prominent actresses, like Peaches Melba was named for a well-known actress of the time. Now, in conjunction with his partner César Ritz, they were asked to take over management of the Savoy Hotel in London. And they moved to London, made a great success of this hotel, although that was shrouded in a little bit of, let's say, funny business. As it turned out, they were both taking kickbacks from suppliers and kind of ripping off the owners. This kind of clouds Escoffier's reputation a bit, although they kind of settled out of court and figured everything else out. After the Savoy, they started a hotel named after Cesar, which was called the Ritz in partnership with a Mr. Carlton. So the hotel was the Ritz Carlton, a brand that still exists today and is known for being very luxurious, high attention to detail, very service oriented, and kind of a lasting testament to these two men who were really powerhouses of 19th century dining. The third of our greats of 19th century cooking was Alexis Soyer, again, another Frenchman. He survived the kind of mini revolution of 1830 and thought it would be best to get out of town, literally, because he had been associated with the Napoleonic regime and people were kind of down on that at that point. So he managed to hightail it, like Escoffier did, over to London, where he took over the kitchen of a place called the Reform Club. And that place was noted for its kitchens. He designed them in kind of a different way. Hopefully I can find some pictures of the Reform Club. Don't know if any photographs exist, but there are probably some drawings. And among his innovations was the introduction of cooking with gas and temperature regulation for ovens. So, he really was kind of one of the technological wizards of his day. Now, in addition to being a well-known chef and obviously innovator in terms of equipment, he was also a humanitarian. During the Irish potato famine, he suggested opening soup kitchens, and he donated percentages of the sales of his cookbook to the relief of various humanitarian causes. And that's a tradition that continues with many chefs today. Very many of us go into this profession, whether we know it or not, because we like to take care of people. We like feeding people, we like seeing people happy, we don't want to see people suffering, struggling, in pain. Now obviously that is not a quality that is unique to chefs, cooks, people in the restaurant business, but very often there is this kind of inner drive to make sure that our fellow human beings feel good, have eaten well, and are happy. So I think of Soyer as kind of one of the first really good examples of the humanitarian chef. Another of these 19th century chefs was Charles Ranhofer. Sounds German. He was actually born in France, but really he's thought of mostly as an American chef because the bulk of his career was spent at the New York restaurant Delmonico's, which was considered probably the best restaurant in the country around the time from, say, the Civil War to just at the dawn of the 20th century. It was a very fancy place, and again, many well-known people went there. We think of these days kind of this farm-to-table movement or local produce, sustainable cooking, all of those kinds of buzzwords that we hear. We think of this as being something that's new, but in truth it was not. Delmonico's was one of the first places to acquire farms so that they could get the best produce, the best meats, things like that. Certainly there had been places in the French and English and even American countryside where there might be a little garden attached to a country inn, but Delmonico's was, squarely in New York City, a huge metropolitan area even at that time, and, having the resources, the money, and the available transportation to make a farm-to-table restaurant really a reality was kind of an innovation then. So this was in the late 1800s. So when we see people now talking about their farm-to-table cuisine and acting as though this is something new, we can know that that's really not the case. This had been done before and probably done better by people before us. Ranhofer also wrote a cookbook called The Epicurean, which you can find in PDF versions on a few different websites. I recommend checking it out. I love, 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 love looking at historical menus to see the kinds of things that people ate, the things that people were willing to pay for, all of that kind of stuff. It's really fascinating, and often find that everything that we think is new really